March 1st, 2000, Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia. It was one of those mornings where the sun comes up lazy and warm over the Hunter Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that make you forget, just for a second, that anything bad could ever happen in a place like this. Aberdeen was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of place where you'd wave at your neighbor even if you didn't particularly like them, because that's just what you did. A coal mining town, a farming community, a tight-knit pocket of Australia where people worked hard, drank at the local pub on weekends, and trusted that tomorrow would look pretty, much like today. But this morning was different. John Price's neighbor noticed something off around 6 a.m. John's car was still in the driveway. Now, for most people, a car in a driveway wouldn't raise an eyebrow. But John was a creature of habit. He worked at the local abattoir, the slaughterhouse just outside of town, and he was always gone before sunrise. His ute would be pulling out of that driveway by 5:30 a.m. every single day. Like clockwork. The neighbor looked at his watch, then back at the house. The curtains were drawn, everything was still, quiet, too quiet. And then he saw it. Blood. On the front door. Not a smear, not a small stain you could explain away as maybe someone cut their hand or had a nosebleed. No, this was different. This was streaked across the door in a way that made your stomach drop. The neighbor felt that primal instinct kick in, the one that tells you something is very, very wrong. He didn't knock. He didn't call out. He went straight home and called the police. 2 officers arrived at 8:10 a.m., Officer Matthews and Officer Furlonger. They approached the house cautiously, tried the front door. Locked. They called out, no answer. They walked around the side of the house, tried windows, peered inside, and then they went to the back door, jimmied it open, and stepped inside John Price's home. What they found would later be described by a judge as beyond contemplation in a civilized society. The first thing that hit them was the smell. Metallic, thick, the kind of smell that coats the back of your throat and makes you want to gag. Then they saw the blood. It was everywhere. On the walls, pooled on the floor, smeared across doorways. The officers moved carefully through the house, hands on their weapons, hearts pounding, not knowing if whoever did this was still inside. They found John Price in the hallway, or what was left of him. His body had been stabbed at least 37 times. Front and back. Deep, vicious wounds that had penetrated vital organs. But that wasn't the worst of it. Not even close. John Price had been skinned. His entire skin had been removed from his body with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who had done this kind of thing before. Not to a person, maybe, but to something. The skin was hanging from a meat hook in the living room doorway, positioned like some kind of grotesque curtain. His head had been removed. And in the kitchen, on the stove, were 2 pots. Inside those pots were parts of John Price's body, cooked with vegetables, potato, pumpkin, zucchini, cabbage, cooked like a stew. 2 plates had been set at the dining table, each with a name card. The plates were meant for John Price's 2 adult children. Officer Matthews would later say that in his 30 years of service, he had never seen anything that came close to this. He stood in that hallway, staring at what used to be a human being, and for the first time in his career, he felt genuine fear. Not fear of being hurt. Fear of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. They found Katherine Knight in the bedroom. She was lying on the bed, unconscious, surrounded by empty pill bottles. She had attempted to end her own life after butchering her partner and cooking him for dinner. She was rushed to the hospital, stomach pumped, stabilized, and then she was arrested. Katherine Mary Knight became the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her case file was marked with 3 words that had never been used for a woman in Australia before, never to be released. But how did it get to this point? How does someone go from being a mother, a grandmother, a seemingly normal member of a small town, to committing one of the most depraved murders in the nation's history? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand who Katherine Knight was, where she came from, and all the warning signs that everyone missed or chose to ignore along the way. Before we dive into Katherine's story, we need to talk about John, Because John Price wasn't just a victim. He was a father, a friend, a hardworking man who loved his kids and tried to do right by people, and he deserved so much better than what happened to him. John Charles Thomas Price was born and raised in Aberdeen. He was 44 years old when he died, but people who knew him said he seemed younger. He had that easy Australian charm, the kind of bloke who'd help you move furniture or lend you his tools without asking when you'd bring them back. He worked at the same abattoir where Katherine worked, though he'd been there much longer. Started as a laborer and worked his way up over the years. John had been married before. Twice, actually. He had 3 children from his previous relationships, and by all accounts he was a devoted father. His kids meant everything to him. He'd take them fishing, teach them how to fix things around the house, show up to every school event he could manage despite working long hours. His ex-wives would later say that even though their marriages didn't work out, John was always a good dad. Always put the kids first. His friends described him as someone who liked a quiet life. He wasn't flashy, wasn't the type to cause drama or seek attention. After his second marriage ended, John seemed content to just focus on work and his children. He bought a modest house in Aberdeen, nothing fancy, but it was his. He was proud of it. Fixed it up himself, little by little. John's fatal flaw, if you could call it that, was that he saw the good in people. He believed in second chances. When people warned him about Katherine Knight, when they told him about her history, about the violence, about the terrifying things she'd done to previous partners, John would just shake his head and say she'd never been like that with him. She could be difficult, sure. She had a temper, but he could handle it. He'd dealt with difficult before. He couldn't have been more wrong. By February 2000, John Price was a man living in fear. He'd tried to end the relationship with Katherine multiple times, but she wouldn't let him go. She'd threatened to kill him. She'd threatened to kill his children. She'd shown up at his work, at his house, screaming, breaking things, making scenes. His friends begged him to get a restraining order, to go to the police, to do something before it was too late. On February 28, 2000, the day before he died, John Price finally took that step. He went to the Scone Magistrates Court on his way to work and filed for an apprehended violence order, what Americans would call a restraining order. He told his co-workers about it that afternoon. He seemed relieved, lighter almost, like he'd finally taken control of the situation. He told one friend, "I'm done with her. I'm finally done." He had no idea that Katherine Knight had already decided if she couldn't have him, no one would. Katherine Mary Knight was born on October 24, 1955, in the small town of Tenterfield, New South Wales, though she was raised in Aberdeen. And from the very beginning, Katherine's life was marked by dysfunction, violence, and instability. Her mother, Barbara Ruffin, was already married when Katherine was conceived. Barbara was married to a man named Jack Ruffin, and they had 4 sons together. But Barbara was having an affair with a co-worker named Ken Knight. Ken was Jack's friend, which made the whole situation even messier. When Barbara got pregnant with Ken's baby, she didn't hide it. She left Jack and moved in with Ken, taking her 4 sons with her. So Katherine was born into this situation, the product of an affair, the reason her mother's first marriage ended. That's a heavy thing to carry, even if you don't fully understand it as a child. The whispers, the judgment, the way people in a small town look at you when they know your family's dirty laundry. And things at home weren't much better. Ken Knight, Katherine's father, was a violent alcoholic. He drank heavily and often, and when he drank he became aggressive. He would rape Barbara, sometimes multiple times a day. Katherine and her siblings witnessed this violence regularly. In a later psychiatric evaluation, Katherine claimed that she had been essayed by multiple family members from a very young age until she was about 11 years old. She never specified who exactly, and this has never been confirmed, but if true, it would paint a picture of a childhood absolutely destroyed by abuse. At school, Katherine was known as a bully. She terrorized smaller children, used her fists to solve problems, and had a reputation for being mean. Teachers tried to intervene, but it never seemed to stick. Katherine was also functionally illiterate. She never learned to read or write properly, something that would follow her throughout her entire life. At 15, Katherine dropped out of school. Her first job was at a local clothing factory, cutting fabric. It was boring, repetitive work, but it was a paycheck. She stuck with it for about a year, but Katherine had bigger dreams, or rather darker dreams. She'd always been fascinated by the local abattoir, the slaughterhouse on the outskirts of Aberdeen. She'd heard stories from people who worked there, about the blood and the guts and the way you had to know exactly where to cut to separate muscle from bone. Something about it called to her. At 16 years old, Katherine Knight walked into that abattoir and asked for a job. They hired her to cut offal, the internal organs of the animals. It was disgusting work, the kind of job most people couldn't stomach for more than a few days. Katherine loved it. She was good at it too, scarily good. She moved up quickly from cutting offal to boning, learning how to use butcher knives with precision and speed. Her bosses were impressed. She had a natural talent for it, they said. She could break down a carcass faster than men who'd been doing it for 20 years. Katherine was so proud of her work that she requested her own set of knives. Professional butcher knives, sharp as razors, perfectly balanced. When she got them, she didn't leave them at work like most people would. She brought them home, and she hung them on the wall directly above her bed. When people asked her why she kept her work knives above her bed, Katherine would smile that strange smile of hers and say, "So they're always handy if I need them." People laughed it off at the time. "Oh, that's just Katherine, bit odd but harmless." She wasn't harmless. Working at the abattoir wasn't just a job for Katherine Knight. It was where she found her identity, her purpose, her skill set. And it's impossible to talk about Katherine without talking about her relationship with violence, with blood, with cutting into flesh. Her co-workers at the slaughterhouse had mixed feelings about her. On one hand, she was an incredibly hard worker. She'd show up on time, never complained about the work, and could keep pace with anyone on the line. On the other hand, there was something unsettling about how much she enjoyed it. Most people who work in slaughterhouses will tell you that you develop a kind of detachment. You have to, or you'd go insane. You're killing animals day in and day out, and if you think too hard about it, it messes with you. So you compartmentalize. You clock in, do the job, clock out, and try not to think about it. Katherine didn't compartmentalize. She reveled in it. She'd talk about the work in graphic detail to anyone who would listen, sometimes even to people who very clearly didn't want to hear it. She described the way blood smells when it's fresh, the way skin peels back when you make the right cut, the satisfaction of a clean separation between muscle and bone. People would make excuses to walk away, mid-conversation. And then there were the knives. Katherine's knife collection became legendary, and not in a good way. She had her work knives, the ones she kept above her bed, but she also accumulated others over the years. She'd sharpen them obsessively, test them on pieces of meat she'd bring home from work. Her first husband, David Kellett, later told police that she'd sometimes hold one of the knives up to his face while he was sleeping, just to see if he'd wake up. When he did wake up and ask what the hell she was doing, she'd laugh and say she was joking. That's not a joke. That's a threat. Katherine had a rule: the knife stayed above her bed. Always. No matter where she lived, no matter who she lived with, those knives went up on the wall above the bed. She said it was so she'd always have them within reach. Reach for what, exactly? Nobody wanted to ask. One coworker recalled a conversation where Katherine said, "I know how to cut up a body. I do it every day. It's not that different." She said it casually, like she was talking about the weather. People should have listened. In 1973, when Katherine was just 18 years old, she met a man named David Kellett. David was a few years older, and he seemed like a decent guy. Steady job, came from a good family, was looking to settle down. Katherine was smitten, or at least she seemed to be. They dated for a bit, and then David proposed. Katherine said yes, and they planned a simple wedding. Nothing fancy, just close family and a few friends. On the surface, they seemed like any other young couple starting their lives together, but the warning signs appeared on the very first night of their marriage. David would later tell police that on their wedding night, after they'd had intercourse 3 times, he rolled over and fell asleep. He was exhausted, it had been a long day, and he figured 3 times was pretty damn good for a wedding night. He was content. Katherine was not. David woke up to Katherine's hands around his throat. She was strangling him, her face twisted in rage, screaming that he'd only wanted to do it 3 times. What was wrong with him? Didn't he find her attractive? Was he already tired of her? David managed to pry her hands off and shove her away. He was gasping for air, confused, terrified. He tried to calm her down, told her it wasn't like that, he was just tired. Eventually, she stopped screaming. But David didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He just lay there in the dark, wondering what the hell he'd just married into. Things didn't get better from there. Katherine's jealousy and possessiveness were suffocating. If David so much as looked at another woman, Katherine would fly into a rage. She'd scream, throw things, hit him. David learned quickly not to upset her, but the problem was, everything upset her. He couldn't win. In 1974, Katherine gave birth to their first child, a daughter. For a brief moment, David hoped that becoming a mother might mellow Katherine out. Maybe having a baby to focus on would calm her down. It didn't. Katherine was a neglectful mother. She'd leave the baby crying for hours, wouldn't change her diaper, sometimes wouldn't feed her on time. David ended up doing most of the parenting, which was difficult given he was working full-time. He'd come home exhausted, and Katherine would be sitting on the couch smoking a cigarette, ignoring the baby's screams. And then one day David couldn't take it anymore. He told Katherine he was leaving. He'd met someone else, someone who treated him like a human being, and he was. Done. He packed his things and walked out. Katherine's response was immediate and horrifying. The next morning, Katherine dressed her 2-year-old daughter, walked her down to the train tracks and placed her on the railway line. Then she walked away. The little girl sat there, confused and scared, as a train approached in the distance. Thankfully, a passerby saw what was happening and ran onto the tracks, grabbing the child just minutes before the train would have hit her. While this was happening, Katherine walked into the center of Aberdeen with an axe, not a small hatchet, a full-sized axe. She walked into the middle of town and started swinging it around, screaming David's name, threatening to kill anyone who got in her way. She was looking for him. She was going to kill him. The police were called, and they managed to subdue Katherine and take her to a psychiatric hospital. She was held there for a few weeks, evaluated, and then released. The official diagnosis was something along the lines of a brief psychotic episode brought on by the stress of her marriage ending. David Kellett got a restraining order and left town. He would later say that leaving Katherine was the best decision he ever made, and he was terrified for the rest of his life that she'd come back to finish what she started. After David Kellett fled, Katherine spent the next few years raising her 2 daughters alone. Well, not quite alone. Her mother, Barbara, helped out quite a bit, probably because she knew Katherine wasn't capable of doing it on her own. But Katherine was lonely. She wanted a partner, someone to control, someone to call her own. In 1986, 6 years after Kellett left, Katherine met a man named David Saunders. Saunders was a local guy, worked at the mines, seemed decent. Enough. Katherine turned on the charm, and Saunders fell for it. They started dating, and pretty quickly he moved in with her and her 2 daughters. But Saunders had his own apartment too. He kept it, even after moving in with Katherine. He said it was because he wanted a space of his own, somewhere he could go to decompress after work. Katherine hated this. To her, it meant he didn't fully commit. It meant he had 1 foot out the door, and she couldn't stand it. So she decided to show him what she was capable of. One day, Katherine and Saunders got a puppy together, a cute little thing just 8 weeks old. Saunders loved that puppy, played with it every day, talked about training it, the whole deal. Katherine seemed indifferent to the dog, but Saunders didn't think much of it. About 2 months after they got the puppy, Saunders came home from work to find Katherine standing in the kitchen, holding the puppy's lifeless body. Its throat had been slashed. There was blood everywhere. Katherine looked at him, calm as anything, and said, "This is what I'm capable of. This is what I'll do if you don't give up that apartment and commit to me fully." Saunders was horrified. He loved that puppy. But he was also terrified. He realized in that moment that Katherine was capable of absolutely anything. He didn't give up the apartment, but he did become much more careful around her. He started planning his exit. In 1989, Katherine gave birth to Saunders' daughter, and like with Kellett, Saunders hoped that maybe a baby would change things. It didn't. In 1990, Katherine and Saunders got into an argument. Saunders didn't even remember what it was about, just something stupid, the kind of argument couples have all the time. But Katherine didn't let it go. She walked into the kitchen, grabbed a pair of scissors, and stabbed him in the stomach. Saunders clutched his wound and stumbled out of the house, drove himself to the hospital, and got stitched up. When the doctors asked what happened, he lied, said it was an accident. He was too scared to tell the truth. But that was the final straw. Saunders left Katherine for good. He moved to another town, got a new job, and never looked back. He would later testify at Katherine's trial, and even then, years later, he still looked terrified talking about her. After Saunders, Katherine was alone again. She'd burned through 2 relationships, both ending in violence and restraining orders, and her reputation in Aberdeen was getting darker. People whispered about her, avoided her. But Katherine didn't care. She had her job at the abattoir, her knives, and her daughters. And then she met John Price. John worked at the same slaughterhouse as Katherine, though they'd never really interacted much before. He was quiet, kept to himself, focused on his work. But one day in 1994, they struck up a conversation during a break. Katherine turned on the charm. She could be charming when she wanted to be, funny even. She made John laugh. He thought she was interesting, a little rough around the edges, but interesting. They started dating casually at first, grabbing drinks after work, going to the pub, that sort of thing. Katherine was on her best behavior. She didn't yell, didn't throw things, didn't threaten him. She seemed normal for the first time in years. John Price thought maybe he'd met someone he could actually build a life with. In 1995, Katherine moved into John's house. He'd bought a modest place in Aberdeen. Nothing fancy, but it was his. He was proud of it. Katherine seemed happy to be there, at least at first. She cooked, cleaned, helped around the house. John's friends met her and thought she seemed okay. A bit intense, maybe, but okay. But the cracks started to show pretty quickly. Katherine was possessive. If John talked to a female coworker, Katherine would interrogate him for hours. Who was she? What did they talk about? Did he think she was prettier than Katherine? John tried to reassure her, but it never worked. She'd scream, throw things, accuse him of cheating. And then the violence started. Katherine would hit John during arguments. Not playful slaps, but real punches, the kind that left bruises. John was bigger than her, stronger, but he never hit her back. He'd just take it, try to calm her down, hope she'd eventually stop. She didn't. Katherine started threatening John's children. She'd say things like, "If you ever leave me, I'll kill your kids. I'll make sure you never see them again." John's adult children were terrified of her. They begged their father to leave her, told him she was dangerous, that he needed to get out. But John kept making excuses. She didn't mean it. She was just upset. She'd calm down. He was wrong. By 1999, John Price's relationship with Katherine Knight had become a living nightmare. What had started as a seemingly normal relationship had devolved into a cycle of violence, manipulation, and terror. John tried to leave multiple times, but Katherine wouldn't let him go. Every time John would try to end things, Katherine would threaten him. She'd tell him she'd kill him, kill his children, burn his house down. And these weren't empty threats. John knew what she'd done to her previous partners. He knew about David Kellett and the axe incident. He knew about David Saunders and the puppy. He knew Katherine was capable of violence. But he kept hoping she'd change. Katherine had this way of cycling between rage and sweetness that kept John off balance. She'd scream at him, hit him, threaten him, and then the next day she'd apologize, cry, tell him she loved him, promise she'd never do it again. And for a few days things would be okay, almost normal. And then something would set her off and the cycle would start all over again. John's friends were worried sick about him. They'd see him at work with bruises, with cuts, with this haunted look in his eyes. They'd pull him aside and beg him to leave her. "Mate, she's going to kill you," one friend told him. John just shook his head and said he could handle it. In early 2000, things reached a breaking point. Katherine had become increasingly unstable. She was convinced John was cheating on her, even though he wasn't. She'd show up at his work unannounced, search through his things, interrogate his coworkers. It was exhausting, and John was at the end of his rope. On February 28, 2000, John Price made the decision that would ultimately cost him his life. He told Katherine the relationship was over. He wanted her out of his house. He was done. Katherine's response was immediate. She grabbed a knife and stabbed John in the chest. The wound wasn't deep enough to kill him, but it was close. John managed to get the knife away from her and kick her out of the house. She screamed and raged, but he locked the doors and called the police. But he didn't press charges. Instead, he drove to the Scone Magistrates' Court and took out an apprehended violence order, a restraining order. He thought that would be enough. He thought a piece of paper would keep her away. It wouldn't. February 29, 2000, leap year, an extra day in the calendar, and it would be John Price's last. John went to work that day at the abattoir. He seemed lighter, his co-workers would later say. He'd finally taken steps to get away from Katherine. He'd filed the restraining order, told her to stay away, and for the first time in months, he seemed hopeful. He told one co-worker, "It's over. I'm finally free of her." He had no idea Katherine had already decided what she was going to do. That evening, John came home from work, exhausted. He made himself dinner, watched some television, and went to bed around 11 p.m. He locked all the doors, checked the windows, and tried to feel safe in his own home. But Katherine had a key, or she broke in. The exact details have never been fully confirmed, but what is known is that sometime in the middle of the night, Katherine Knight entered John Price's home while he was sleeping. And then she stabbed him. The first wound woke John up, but by then it was too late. Katherine was in a frenzy, stabbing him over and over and over. John tried to fight back, tried to get away, but he was bleeding too much, losing strength too quickly. The autopsy would later reveal that John Price was stabbed at least 37 times. The wounds were all over his body, front and back, deep thrusts that penetrated his lungs, his liver, his heart. It wasn't a quick death. John suffered. He fought for his life, and he almost made it. There was a blood trail that led from the bedroom, through the hallway, to the front door. John had managed to open the front door. He'd gotten outside. For a brief moment he might have thought he was going to make it. He could see the street, see the neighbor's house, see safety just a few feet away. But then he collapsed, or Katherine dragged him back inside. Either way, John Price died in the hallway of his own home, bleeding out, alone, while the woman he'd tried to love stood over him. And then she got to work. What Katherine Knight did after murdering John Price is what elevated this case from a domestic violence tragedy to one of the most disturbing crimes in Australian history. After John was dead, Katherine didn't panic. She didn't flee. She didn't call anyone. Instead, she methodically set about mutilating his body. First, she dragged him into the living room. Then she went to the kitchen and got her knives. Her butcher knives, the ones she'd used for years at the abattoir, the ones she knew how to wield with precision. And then she skinned him. Starting at the head and working her way down, Katherine Knight removed John Price's skin in one complete piece. It would have taken hours. It would have required focus, skill, and a complete lack of empathy. She knew exactly what she was doing. She'd done this to animals hundreds of times before. When she was finished, she took the skin and hung it from a meat hook in the doorway between the hallway and the living room. It hung there like some kind of grotesque decoration, a warning, a trophy. The police officers who found it would later say it was the single most disturbing thing they'd ever seen. But Katherine wasn't done. Next, she decapitated John. She removed his head completely, placed it in a pot on the stove. Then she took parts of his body, his buttocks, pieces of his legs, other sections of flesh, and she cooked them. She peeled vegetables, potatoes, zucchini, pumpkin, squash. She added gravy. She cooked it all together, like she was making a stew, like this was just another dinner. When the food was ready, she plated it. 2 plates, set at the dining room table. She even added garnish, made it look presentable. And then she wrote name cards. 1 plate for John's adult son, 1 plate for John's adult daughter. She was going to feed them their father. After setting the table, Katherine cleaned herself up. She took a shower, washed the blood off, changed into clean clothes. Then she grabbed John's wallet and bank card and drove into town. At 2 a.m., Katherine Knight walked into a convenience store and withdrew $1,000 from John Price's bank account using his ATM card. The store clerk would later say Katherine seemed calm, normal even. She bought a few things, made small talk, and left. Katherine drove back to John's house, walked past his skinned body, past the plates of human flesh, and went into the bedroom. She took a massive overdose of pills, lay down on the bed, and waited to die. But she didn't die. Her body fought the overdose, and when police found her hours later, she was unconscious but alive. When Officer Matthews and Officer Furlonger entered John Price's home on the morning of March 1, 2000, they had no idea what they were walking into. They'd been called to do a welfare check. A neighbor was worried. There was blood on the door. That was all they knew. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Both officers had been on the force for decades. They'd seen car accidents, suicides, overdoses, violent assaults. They thought they'd seen everything. They were wrong. Officer Matthews would later say that the moment he stepped into that hallway and saw John Price's skinned body, something inside him broke. He'd never believed in pure evil before that day. He did now. The crime scene was meticulously documented. Photographs were taken, evidence was collected. Forensic teams spent days combing through every inch of that. The pots on the stove, the plates on the table, the meat hook, the skin, the blood, all of it was catalogued. Katherine was found in the bedroom, barely clinging to life. Paramedics rushed her to the hospital, pumped her stomach, stabilized her. When she regained consciousness, she claimed she didn't remember anything. The pills, she said. The overdose had wiped her memory clean. Detectives didn't believe her. Not for a second. Katherine was arrested and charged with murder. The news spread through Aberdeen like wildfire. People were horrified, sickened, terrified. This had happened in their town, someone they knew, someone they'd worked with. John Price's children were informed of their father's death. They were devastated, traumatized, destroyed. And when they learned what Katherine had tried to do, that she'd tried to feed them their own father, it pushed them beyond comprehension. How do you process that? How do you ever feel safe again? The investigation revealed a pattern of violence that had been escalating for years. Police interviewed David Kellett, David Saunders, John's friends, Katherine's co-workers. Everyone had a story. Everyone had seen the warning signs, and everyone felt a crushing guilt that they hadn't done more. Katherine Knight's trial began in October 2001, nearly 2 years after John Price's murder. The delay was partly due to the sheer volume of evidence, and partly due to Katherine's legal team trying to argue that she was mentally unfit to stand trial. Multiple psychiatric evaluations were conducted. Katherine was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but experts agreed that she knew right from wrong. She knew what she was doing when she killed John Price. She'd planned it, she'd executed it, and she'd tried to cover it up by staging a suicide. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. The evidence was undeniable. Katherine's own actions had sealed her fate. The defense tried to argue that Katherine had been abused throughout her life, that she'd snapped, that this was a crime of passion. But the jury wasn't buying it. The details presented at trial were so graphic, so disturbing, that multiple jurors had to excuse themselves at various points. The courtroom was silent as forensic experts described the skinning process, the cooking, the plates set for the children. People in the gallery wept. John Price's family sat through it all, tears streaming down their faces. forced to relive the worst moment of their lives. David Kellett and David Saunders both testified, describing Katherine's history of violence. They talked about the threats, the beatings, the knife incidents. Kellett broke down on the stand when he talked about finding his daughter on the train tracks. Katherine's defense team tried to paint her as a victim of her circumstances, but it fell flat. How do you excuse what she did? How do you justify it? The jury deliberated for just a few hours before returning with a verdict guilty of murder. On November 8, 2001, Justice Barry O'Keefe stood in the New South Wales Supreme Court and delivered a sentence that would make history. He described Katherine Knight's crime as an act of almost unimaginable horror and stated that her actions were beyond contemplation in a civilized society. He emphasized that Knight had shown no remorse, no empathy, no recognition of the magnitude of what she'd done. And then he sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Katherine Knight became the first woman in Australian history to receive such a sentence. Her case file was marked with a note that had never been used for a woman before, never to be released. Katherine showed no emotion when the sentence was read. She just stared ahead, expressionless, as if the words didn't even register. John Price's family wept with a mix of relief and anguish. Justice had been served, but it didn't bring John back. It didn't erase the trauma, the nightmares, the knowledge of what had been done to him. Aberdeen struggled to move on. The house where John was murdered still stands, though it's been renovated and sold multiple times. People avoid walking past it. There's a heaviness to that street, a darkness that lingers. Katherine Knight is currently imprisoned at Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in Western Sydney. Other inmates know her as the Nana, because she's now in her late 60s, white-haired, soft-spoken, almost grandmotherly. She works in the prison kitchen, ironically. Guards say she's a model prisoner, quiet, obedient, no trouble. But everyone knows what she did. Everyone knows what she's capable of. In prison interviews, Katherine has continued to maintain that she doesn't remember killing John Price. She blames the pills, the overdose, claims it wiped her memory. She's never expressed remorse. She's never apologized to John's family. And she never will, because Katherine Knight will die in prison. There will be no parole hearings, no appeals, no second chances. She will spend the rest of her life behind bars, and when she dies, that will be the end of it. The case of Katherine Knight forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, about warning signs ignored, about how many chances someone gets before society steps in. John Price's friends knew Katherine was dangerous. His children begged him to leave. He'd filed a restraining order, and still he died. How many women are killed by partners every year? How many men? How many times do we hear, "I never thought it would go this far"? Katherine Knight is an extreme case, one of the worst. But the patterns leading up to it, the escalation of violence, the threats, the control, those patterns are heartbreakingly common. John Price was a good man who deserved to live a long life, to watch his children grow, to retire, to find happiness. Instead, he was butchered in his own home by someone he'd tried to love. Katherine Knight is a monster. There's no other word for it. What she did goes beyond murder. It was desecration. It was evil. And she will never see the outside of a prison cell again. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out. There are resources, hotlines, shelters. It's not your fault, and you don't have to stay. You deserve to be safe. Thank you for watching this video. This was a difficult case to cover, and I appreciate you taking the time to learn about it. Please take care of yourselves, and remember that even in the darkest stories, we have to keep talking about them. We have to keep saying their names. John Charles Thomas Price, a father, a friend, a victim. Rest in peace, John.